All right, is the final lecture of the course. Congratulations for making it through. Um, Hopefully, this is also the last online lecture you have to do for a while, right? We are back in person in the fall. Hope you're looking forward to it. Hope we can make it all happen safely. I have faith in you folks and our university. I think we're all responsible, smart people. I think it's going to go well. So, congratulations for making it through. Um, so this lecture is on AI ethics and predictive policing by Peter Asaro. So predictive policing is the use of historic crime data to identify individuals or geographic areas with elevated risks for future crimes in order to target them for increased policing. They look through the data, right? They see this, they find an algorithm again that can predict sort of hotspots where crimes are likely to occur, and they try to make sure that cops are there sort of before anything happens to catch them. Some of the problems associated with predictive policing include sort of the ethics of treating people as potential criminals, right? Um, if you've seen, maybe I think somewhere I have a um, something from Minority Report. If you ever watched Minority Report, it's basically about this. They have sort of what they call precogs, right? People who can see the future, so they have a pre-crime division in the police department. This is from RoboCop, but um, so yeah, uh, right? Treating people as potential criminals. There's going to be an inherent bias sometimes on these data sets they use as well. So Asaro is going to propose an approach grounded in care ethics. So I told you these, we discussed care ethics in the very first um, lecture, and I told you these would come back. So it's finally coming back. Uh, so he's going to argue for an approach to if predictive policing is going to work or any sort of data-based, right, crime prevention strategy should be grounded in a care ethics that keeps in mind the social context of the data. Okay, so a little background on AI ethics. There's sort of two ways that Asaro thinks you can conceive of AI ethics. One would be about producing machines that themselves can make ethical decisions, right? Can factor ethical considerations into their calculations. And then another way to think about AI ethics is about the ethical consequences of letting AIs make decisions. And that's sort of more what Asaro is going to be talking about here. So there's lots of ways that AIs can produce unethical decisions. Maybe the algorithm is a little too simple to capture the complexity of the system it's trying to model. Maybe it doesn't know how to handle sort of outliers in the data. It might build in and perpetuate bias that's in the system. So again, these are decisions that it's making. They're not strictly speaking ethical decisions, but nonetheless, there can be ethical concerns about how the decisions are made. So if it's denying credit or charging higher interest to poor people, again, that's building in these biases we have in our system, and it may not be ethical. It is sort of efficient or whatever, right? Optimal, but from whatever criteria the algorithm is using. But even if the AI isn't itself unfair in these ways, um, there still might be social factors that encourage humans to use the AI in unfair ways. So, to illustrate this point, Asaro contrasts two different ways of viewing AI ethics, models of threat and ethics of care. And he has sort of two examples of the way that data was used um, and the outcomes that came from it. So, um, these statistical methods in policing have been around for a bit. They're at least as old as what was called CompStat, and that was first used in New York City in 1995. So it would take crime data, other data, and it would produce these heat maps of the city that showed sort of high crime areas, right? And then police departments would focus their resources on those areas and surveillance equipment on those areas, um, which then produce more data, right? If you're surveilling, you're producing more data, which then requires more processing by computers in this sort of self-perpetuating cycle. So that's sort of a model of threats, right? So the model of threat for policing sees the world as sort of divided into two types of people. You got threats and non-threats, right? Potential criminals and not non-potential criminals. Um, Whereas the ethics of care instead conceives policing as sort of having a duty to protect, care for systems. for citizens, right? Instead of, again, threats and non-threats, they're all people that need to be cared for. Um, so on the model of threat, the point of AI is to identify the threats and then you focus resources on them before they can commit a crime, right? Whereas the ethics of care is going to focus on personal relationships as the normative model of behavior. So in your personal life, right, with your friends and your loved ones, you don't necessarily identify threats and then neutralize them, right? Um, no, instead you're trying to understand people, trying to help them. You want better outcomes for everybody. Eliminate threats. So Asaro takes the example of Chicago because there were two different programs um, that happened. So there was a spike in gun violence at one point, and at one point it was the most violent city in the nation, right? So there were two different research programs that uh, were created to sort of help try to address this problem. Um, one called the Heat List, and the other was called One Summer, and they both were attempting to identify youths at risk of being involved in gun violence. Um, so the first one, the heat list, sort of like the program in New York, right? They'd create these heat maps um, and try to identify, it was a heat list, right? And it would identify youths at risk of being involved in gun violence. And then so that they become targets of surveillance by police. One summer, the other approach identified the same youths and instead gave them access to social services and resources, right, that were aimed at reducing the likelihood of their involvement in violence. Okay, so first the heat list. So again, data from individuals, people in their social circles regarding arrests, convictions, gang affiliations were compiled into like a score from 1 to 500, and it indicated your risk of being involved in a violent crime. Now, a high score didn't necessarily mean that you had been arrested or even um, involved in anything violent. You may just have been socially connected to people with criminal. But cops only knew the score. And so in many cases, they assumed that if you had a high score, that meant you were a criminal, right? You were a threatening person. Um, so what would happen was the cops would sort of like, okay, this person's on the heat list. I better keep an eye on them and I'll pop in on them, right? They'd randomly visit them. Or just like if a crime happens somewhere, they'll be like, okay, round up the people on the heat list that are high, right? Whether or not there's any sort of actual evidence linking them to the crime. So, and it did turn out that 85% of the 2,100 shooting victims that year were on the list. I mean, it was a big list, though. It had 400,000 people on it. Um, Turned out the program really had no impact on the rates of violence among these people. It did increase their likelihood of arrest, but that's probably predict that pretty easily, right? Um, Details of the algorithm weren't revealed to the public, right? So there was some suspicion that it lumped together, it sort of embodied some historical racial biases, right, that would be reflected in the data. Um, it also lumped together victims and perpetrators of violence, right? Um, so it sort of makes sense on the model of threat, right? So if you're a victim of violence, then maybe you would want to retaliate, right? Particularly maybe in a gang context. But ethically, it seems really problematic to treat victims of violence effects, right? Um, so not super successful. So the other program, One Summer, identified sort of the same at-risk people and offered them a job. Um, Not a great job, it's at minimum wage, but a job. Right? So they're identified by soliciting and reviewing applications from at-risk schools. Right, the average participant had missed about 6 weeks of school. About 20% of the participants had been arrested. Um, At-risk schools were identified by historical data on violence, income, proximity to areas with high rates of violence, and so on. So not, I think I may have made the implication that it was the exact same data, right, and the exact same list. Now, there were different approaches. One was based on criminal records, one was based on more social factors as well. But the idea was the same. They were picking out people that they were concerned would be involved in violent crime, right? Now, this program, it seemed, had some positive consequences, right? It found a 51% decrease in violence-related arrests among the participants. They also did better at school and, well, of course, made more money, right? They had a job. So Asaro wants to sort of say this is a sort of model of an ethics of care, right? It treats the subjects as people rather than threats, treats them as respect, and thinks about, okay, what do they need if they're at risk? What do they need to get them out of that risky or to help them out of it, or at least give them a opportunity. Now, it's still a data-driven approach, right? But the purpose it was put to was different. Uh, it also started with a goal, right, from the outset to which the data collection was aimed and tailored, right? It wasn't just let's collect the data, see what happens, right? They had an intention behind the data collection. So again, because the aim of policing is ostensibly to serve and protect, uh, it's actually a good candidate for a care ethical sort of framework to view it within that framework. And since AI is frequently used in managing human relationships, it may be of use there as well. So it's not that policing, according to this author, or using data in policing is necessarily uh, going to lead to sort of coercive or bad outcomes, right? You could incorporate it into an ethics of care. Um, so some issues associated with data, right? So crime data has been around for a long time, but the issue has frequently been manipulated, right? So police departments, um, they they have a motivation to suppress statistics that look bad. Often data reflects these racial biases and these historical issues. So we can't take it for granted that the data paints an accurate picture, right? So you do have to take data in context. Um, and so the people collecting data, if you want to do again, a care ethical approach to predictive policing, um, they need to be trained in the ethics of care so they understand context and can see the data in the right sort of context. Models. So models are very important. Anytime you've got data, right, it's going to be meaningless if it's not associated with a model. And all that means is, you've got a number in the spreadsheet, but what does the number mean? So to take one example, um, an act that's criminal can be categorized in different ways, right, with different consequences. And which bin that data point ends up in matters a lot for the person who commits it or is affected by it. So, um, say there's a theft. Well, is it petty larceny or is it a felony theft, right? Felony, much harsher sentences. Well, whether it's a felony depends on the value of the item that was stolen. Okay. Is it, I think it's like if it's more than 800 bucks, 900 bucks, it's a felony, right? Okay, so say you stole a TV. Well, how do we price that out item, right? Is it the purchase price at Best Buy, right? Or is it's a used TV now? Is it its current market value, right? Again, that can make the difference. So, um, the way you model this data is important, and you want to be trained uh, in an ethics of care and sensitivity to these sorts of details and the potential consequences. And then C, putting AI into practice. So beyond how the data is coded, we need to be very sensitive to ethical concerns when we finally put that data to use. So again, it was sort of similar types of data, not the exact same data set that was used for both the heat list and the one summer program, but the results are very different, right? So just because you collect data, design an algorithm, and you've got care ethics in mind there, you can't then just hand off the algorithm and wash your hands and say, I did my job, right? You have to also be concerned about how it's being employed. Um, and that was part of the problem with the heat list is the officers using it didn't really understand the process, the mechanics behind the list. They assumed if you had a high number, you were a criminal, even when you could get a high number just by actually being a victim of violence or just having a relative or a friend that's involved in violence. So there needs to be this connection between right the data, the algorithm, and then the people that are going to be using it. And they both need to be aware. Um, it, again, the ethics of care would dictate we pay attention to the limitations of the system. Um, and when you design the system, think about the people who are going to be using it so that you can prevent people misusing it. Okay, so that's it for the course. So hopefully you have your papers, you've had a chance to look at the comments and revise them. And remember, you'll have one last quiz even after you turn in your paper. Um, and then you will be free. And make sure to turn in your evaluations. There's sets of evaluations, right? One for me, one for your TAs. And we love to get your feedback. It's actually very important for us in our careers. It is used in when people evaluate our effectiveness. And I like to get lots of data, right? So if I have one or two people that, for whatever reason, had a bad experience and want to, slam me, that's fine, slam me. But you know, I want to, if that's a couple data points in a larger set, then great, then I will accept that. But if all the people that liked it just sort of didn't bother to fill out the evaluation, then I just get one or two bad Yelp reviews. That's not good data. I like good data. So hopefully you all will take the time to those evals. And yeah, that is it.